So my name is Natalie Burr, and I am a huge history nerd. So something that has been a part of my life since I was incredibly young. This guy right there, I call him Grandpa Bob because I'm actually directly related to him, and the date 1302 is when he was alive. And there's actually a picture in my house of this brass from his grave in Acton, England, and he was a knight under, I think, Edward I. And so I know him as Great-Grandpa Bob, and that's kind of how I've grown up with this perspective of my history. And so you can see the resemblance between us clearly. We go way back. And then also another really important part of my history is Aaron Burr. So my last name is Burr, and in elementary school, this is the guy that shot Alexander Hamilton, and he was kind of a crazy person. And so people would always be like, oh, you're like related to this absolutely crazy person. And I'd be like, no, maybe not. I'm not actually related to him. But I was always sort of aware of this really important historical presence in my life. And I've always felt very comfortable with history. And history's sort of always been the thing that I want to do with my life and what I want to dedicate my life to. So I interned at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is on Boylston Street. It was founded in 1791, and we moved into this building in 1899. So it's actually almost as old as the nation itself. It's the oldest historical society in the country. And we have millions of manuscripts, letters, artifacts. We host like a series of events over the course of the year. One of the things that's actually going on there right now is they're trying to digitize all of their paper material, which is a vast, like huge undertaking. So I was really involved with that. This is what the building looks like today. So it's the same building. It's really gorgeous, right near Berkeley. And I would actually go in, take the T every day, except for sometimes when my dad drove me. And I would have this really nice walk through Boston. And it was really, really interesting to sort of feel like I was like immersed in this work environment. And so I was super excited to start. Like on the first day of, and so this was like something that I had all these goals for my project. And I'm really interested in Hegel, so he's a historian. And he had these three different types of history. Original history, which is, think about that like a primary source. So like a lot of these like Greek and Roman historians were writing about events that were happening as they happened. And that's sort of like when you think about like letters, primary sources. Reflective history is what you read in textbooks. So anything about like facts that you read in a textbook. And what I'm really, really fascinated with is philosophic history. And so what that is historiography, and that's the study of history. I know that looks like a typo, but it's not. Because even history, which is in itself its own study, its own sort of pursuit, you can study the actual study of history. So I had all these questions that I wanted to answer about, what is it to study history? Can you study history without a bias? Is there any way to get like the full picture of what history is? So going into my internship at the Massachusetts Historical Society, I was ready to answer all of these questions, incredibly excited. This was me on the first day. I don't know if any of you guys watch The Office. That's a really very enthusiastic character from the show. And so I was feeling like that. I just was so ready to dive into my work and like become part of this industry that I've been fascinated with since basically, I could talk or, understand. And the first week was a lot of this. So it's an email list that I worked on of all the social studies and history coordinators in Massachusetts, about 400 different schools and names that I was researching, kind of just Googling, and it got pretty tedious after a while and didn't really have much to do with history. I also transcribed some documents to put online, to digitize, so that meant, there was a 92-page handwritten document by Clara Barton that was actually pretty interesting to read, but typing that up, 92 pages, was not the most entertaining thing that I could have imagined myself doing. So about day 5, end of the week, I was ready to go home. I was like, thank God it's Friday. Like, I am out of here. Like, this is not what I wanted at all. And I was thinking, like, it's my senior spring. I'm not going to waste this opportunity at like this really incredible place. There's got to be something for me here. So I was very inspired by this quote from Thomas Jefferson, who we actually have all of his presidential papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And do you want to know who you are? Don't ask, act. Action will delineate and define you. So I sort of took this quote and applied it to my internship. I talked to my supervisor. I was like, I'm not really feeling what I'm doing. Like, I understand intern work is very important, and I appreciate that, but I'm here to answer questions. And I acted, and I sort of took charge and focused on something different. And so this yielded results. Something I worked on that's a letter from Frederick Douglass's son to Frederick Douglass about his time in the Civil War and some of the discrimination that he faced as a black Union soldier, even among his fellow soldiers. So I transcribed that for a Civil War and Abolition project at the NNHS. I also made a timeline based on this book for a maritime program that we were doing. It involved basically reading the book and pulling out important dates. You know, for example, going back to the 300s BC when the first mentions of silk traders and silk weaving in Europe were mentioned. And so that was a really interesting project, and I learned a lot from that. And then I actually, based on that book, I got to work with the actual document of the log of the ship Columbia, which was the first American ship to circumnavigate the globe. And so I was working in the reading room because we have this huge research library. It's open to anyone. If you ever have any research, I recommend you go there because it is really fascinating. And I was working with these 18th century documents and sort of skimming through them, through all the supply lists and all the list of how much everyone on the ship got paid, and letters from the owner and the captain of the ship, the actual chop of the ship, which was when they got to China to, unload their cargo and trade. So you had actual Chinese handwriting and signatures from all of the various trading merchants allowing the ship to pass through. So these are all really interesting things that I did. And even so, I was learning so much about history, and I still didn't really feel like I was answering the questions that I was there to answer. I was sort of doing this work that had already been done, that I was sort of reinterpreting for the website, for programs, and I still wasn't feeling very inspired. So I sort of had this existential crisis of sorts with maybe 1 or 2 weeks left. And I didn't really know where I wanted to go anymore with, my love of history. And I felt really lost, honestly. And so this is a quote. That's Napoleon Bonaparte looking a little sad. History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree on. So this is sort of the mindset that I adopted, with 1 week or 1 or 2 weeks left in my internship, that there wasn't really anything left for me to discover in history, that there wasn't anything new, that everything had already been interpreted, and even all of the old books and things that everyone had written, I didn't really feel like there was a place for me in history anymore. I felt like I could just, do office work, and that was the extent of what my historical career would be. So I was feeling incredibly discouraged. And then on the last night of my internship, I went to an event, a speaker named Jasmine Nicole Cobb, and she wrote this book called Picture Freedom, and her talk was sort of about remaking Black visuality and identity, because in the 19th century, when you think about Black people in America, you think slavery, you think Civil War and abolition, and there are actually tons of upper middle class Black families living in the North, and no one really talks about that. No one really thinks about that as a part of American history. So she wrote this book about it, basically giving information. She gave a talk, and at the end she answered questions from our membership, which was the people who usually attend these events are old white people for the most part. And so she combated a lot of these actually pretty racially insensitive questions. And not only did she answer them in a really interesting historical context, she also really changed sort of the viewpoints of the people who she was talking to and made them really understand what she was talking about, and in a context that was both informative and really, she sort of reversed what they were thinking, which I thought was super inspiring. And it totally kind of made me realize that maybe I don't want to be working at somewhere like the Massachusetts Historical Society in 10 years, but I could be, doing what she is doing, which she's a graduate, an associate professor at Northwestern, and she's written a book, and now she's sort of going around and giving talks about this book. And I thought that was so inspiring, because I think that there's so many different ways that you can change historical writing now, and I see that there are different ways that you can look at history, even stuff that happened 100 years ago that's been written about, that's just been basically beaten dead through different writing, through textbooks, through learning, because now you have new historical techniques that come with new technology that we have, ways to date different objects that are being discovered. the age of information means that we have all of these different new ways to interpret, to put information out there. It's even harder to get accurate information on the internet. I know that we all have heard never use Wikipedia as a reliable source. So that sort of conversation is one that's still being had. Digitized records, what I was doing at the NNHS with typing things up and putting everything online, and the fact that we can put everything online, and in a way, you know, by creating all these social media profiles, we're sort of ingraining our own history on the internet, and that is something that is going to be a really interesting thing to see. In 50 years, are we all going to have our entire history with every little thing put out on our timelines on Facebook? And then this is something that I'm really interested in, the changing perspectives on class, race, gender, and sexuality. So as we become sort of a more integrated and a more global world, a global community, we sort of have to accept these new things, these new movements, and these new different types of people who we're going to encounter all the time. Because even if you do live and stay in one place for your entire life with the internet, you're going to have to be exposed to all these different diverse people and different perspectives. And so, for example, like as a woman, like most of history is not about me. Like most of history has to do with like older white men. And so what I think is really interesting is going back and looking at, what were women doing and what were people of color doing, and how are these different things going to play into a new interpretation of history, and how will we see history differently based on this? And so this is another quote by Thomas Jefferson that I just thought sort of summed up how I felt at the end of my experience. I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past. And so what this sort of means to me is that even though the past is what it is, and no one can change that. You can go back and you can interpret it, but also the future provides something else in addition to this past. And the future provides a context for the past, and it provides a different way to look at it. Even though, what happened, there's another way to see everything that did happen. And as we move forward, the past does sort of change in our eyes and in society's eyes. And so this sort of inspired me, and now I think that I know what I want to do. I mean, obviously this is subject to change, but I want to study history in the context of social activism and political activism, and how the past is going to influence what we do in the future, and how our lives are going to change in the future based on the past. And that was sort of my revelation at the end of my internship. So if you want to read anything else about my internship, you can just visit my website. I have my blog there. Thank you.